Hello, my name is Zeus, a writer for Healing Maps, and let's talk about if one bad trip can cause even more bad trips. In the course of recreational and medicinal use of psychedelics, one may encounter what's called a bad trip. No more. So what's the scientific definition of a bad trip? It's a maladaptive cognitive adjustment to the subjective and sometimes physical effects of taking a dose of psychedelics. In other words, a psychedelic triggers something scary in your head or your environment, and it could ruin the entire experience. You're probably asking yourself, what's the root of a bad trip? Well, that's hard to pinpoint, and it obviously varies from each person and each psychedelic. However, the long-held theory is there are two distinguishing factors that can influence a psychedelic experience: set and setting. There's a chance you've heard of set and setting. Maybe I've told you about set and setting before. It's a theory invented by the late and legendary Timothy Leary. It states that set, which is your mental predisposition before, during, and after a psychedelic experience, along with setting, which is the environment, objects, and people around you while experiencing a psychedelic. It's theorized that both set and setting plays a significant factor on what the subjective experience or trip will be. If you take LSD while you're fighting for your life inside of a haunted house, don't be surprised if it's not the smoothest psychedelic experience. Just decided to take an eighth of shrooms after your significant other broke up with you, then left you on red? That trip may be a little bit rocky. Also, it may not. And that's the wonderful thing about neuroscience, psychology, and how psychedelics innervates it all. These are all things scientists are relentlessly trying to unravel, but let's get back to if one bad trip causes you to have more bad trips. The idea that one bad psychedelic trip may cause more bad trips in the future is based on something in neuroscience called Hebbian theory. Hebbian theory is actually a highly important and often overlooked concept when a person is under psychedelics, especially since we have so much evidence of Hebbian theory actually taking place in the brain while tripping. But what is Hebbian theory? Well, Hebbian theory is an idea proposed way back in the day, 1949 actually, by Donald Hebb, a guy from Canada, so Canada represent. It's a simple yet complex theory, basically that brain cells that fire together wire together. Yeah, that sounds cool, but it's actually a little bit more complex than that, a lot more complex. What this means is if a brain cell constantly passes information to the same brain cell or group of brain cells over and over again, these brain cells will neurologically adapt to facilitate an easier connection with less effort. Okay, imagine driving the same long route from home to work every day. This long route will 100% get you from point A to point B. However, now that you've taken this long route many times, you begin to learn shortcuts through neighborhoods and ways to avoid traffic to make your commute not only faster, but easier. That's basically Hebbian theory, but with cars. Yes. Hebbian theory is also reflected in a thing that's happening in your brain right now. It's called long-term potentiation, or LTP, and it may be the reason why one bad trip can be the start of many bad trips. Long-term potentiation, LTP, is Hebbian's fire together, wire together concept, but it strictly involves the synapse, which is the small gap of space where all your psychedelics travel from brain cell to brain cell. LTP can make the connection synapses have stronger, which is theorized to increase the effects of psychedelics. So if you have a bad trip on psychedelics, the brain cells that connect during this experience will remember its existing connection through Hebbian LTP. And not only that, but the actual synaptic connection, which is remember how your brain receives psychedelics, may intensify through something called long-term synaptic plasticity, which is also very closely related to Hebbian theory. So it could be that if you have a bad trip, the next time you take psychedelics, your brain will connect with the same cells that facilitated your initial bad trip, like a never-ending vortex of your brain creating bad trips because that's all it knows. Keep in mind, this is a psychedelic theory based on the long-held neuroscientific concept of Hebbian theory. However, a psychedelic trip is not so one-dimensional. As mentioned earlier, a bad trip isn't necessarily facilitated through just neuronal connections, but a multitude of factors like set and setting. Also, a bad trip to some could be perceived as a good trip to others. It's all subjective, and especially when we're dealing with something that relies almost entirely on its subjectivity, like psychedelics. Things can get way more complex than what we're ready to handle. So does one bad trip cause more bad trips? Perhaps. I mean, there's neuroscience behind that idea, but also maybe not, since we're still discovering things about psychedelics, especially bad trips.